Our next panel is going to be diving all into the IP opportunities available in gaming. And to kick things off, we have our wonderful moderator, Jasper Brand, a partner at BITKRAFT. And alongside him, he will be joined by Crowley, a CEO at Trioscope, Derick Tsai, an executive and consultant, previously at Riot Games and Bungie. And last but not least, David Watanabe, CEO at 555 Comics. Round of applause, please.
Thank you. Hey everyone, great to be here to talk about Transmedia with some great minds in the space today, in a time where the Barbie and the Super Mario movie keep surpassing each other with like $1.5 billion in grossing and only dev budgets of 100 to 150 million. And you're not even looking at what this does to the IP uplift and other sales. So really excited to have LC, who's a creative visionary who spent quite some time at Adult Swim, Netflix, and a few other places and worked with some global brands like AT&T. And Derick Tsai, who's a development executive and producer across some of the biggest names in the space that we know, like Riot and Bungie and Nike. And Ben, who's a content strategist and game designer, story designer, who created the largest anime VTuber on TikTok, and also led some social design for 50 Cent before. Ben, why don't we start with you? Why don't you tell us a little bit more about what 555 is doing?
Yeah, so we create transmedia stories that start on Twitter or TikTok. They're fictional worlds that are told in real time. So when the character wakes up, Luna's complaining about going to school. At school, she's complaining about being brainwashed, and at night, she's headed into the woods to hunt down a phantom clown. Really exciting stories, like if Stranger Things characters lived on social rather than on TV, so that you can develop a relationship with them.
Awesome. Derick, tell us a little bit about your journey.
Sure. Most recently, I was head of Transmedia, senior exec at Bungie, and a big part of it was like Bungie is like one of the greatest shooters ever made, and it was about taking it to different mediums, attracting new audiences, a deepen fandom in a different way, and kind of taking advantage of like all the different mediums besides gaming. And previous to that, I was producing and directing at Riot Games, and just making short films to represent like League of Legends in a slightly different way too, because I was there during the expansion and working on the new products they had besides League, like Legends of Runeterra, and like TFT and Valorant and whatnot. And it was like League, but like a little bit to the left or a little bit to the right to just really expand and broaden out the IP.
Awesome. LC, tell us a little bit about how Trioscope came together and what you're cooking up there.
Yeah, sure. So my career background had always been about kind of Frankensteining some kind of content idea with, some kind of new technology, and Trioscope kind of came out of that, really identifying, particularly in the linear content space, the need for kind of a new unlock, some sort of new solve for really large scope and scale IP that was kind of locked behind a cost wall. And so Trioscope has now developed what we call the stylized entertainment engine, which is really designed to sort of provide sort of maximum scope, scale, spectacle at a fraction of the cost in sort of a very pipelinified or automated way.
Awesome. If we're staying there for 1 minute, you just had a project with Amigos that's about to wrap up. That's a fun one. How has it been working with people from music who are starting to look into the TV and linear format?
Yeah, it's cool. I mean, so we have this IP called Takeover, and it really is sort of been designed from the very beginning to be a transmedia. So it's I think a good topic. It's an underground street racing, kind of underground takeover culture. If anybody has seen these happening in cities across the U.S. and other places, we brought in Quavo from Migos fame to star and also to sort of be the sort of lead avatar of the whole world. It's cool. I mean, he doesn't quite get it all. He's like, I want to be in an action movie, and that's sort of like, okay, cool, we'll start there. And but somebody who's got 29 million Instagram followers is a good place to start when you're making a movie.
Not bad, not bad. When it comes to followers, Ben, how does the storytelling end up working for you into engaging audiences on a continued basis across different platforms? How has it been starting the first of the creators, and then you also have some interesting stuff on fans actually coming into roleplay and engaging with the IP?
Yeah, I think it's about giving them access. I think transmedia isn't just about going across different mediums. I think the key ingredient these days is giving them access to create. Lots of times that can be very scary with an IP. I think of it as like riding a sandworm from Dune. Like they'll buck you, throw you off in a second, but you got to be along for the ride. And so we really make sure that with our transmedia stories that the fans can create, that the characters respond to them, engage, and pull them in. I think it's adding that extra dimension to a story that's really key. Getting them to be biased because they feel like you're their friend as well, which for our team, they really do value that relationship.
Awesome, awesome. Derick, the League of Legends universe has lots of very famous characters with their 100 million plus monthly audience. How has it been for you going through that journey? What are some of the key learnings taking IPs from games and bringing them into other mediums?
Sure, I think it's about like breaking down each champion into like key pillars. There's always like identifying elements, iconic like elements. And I think if you can take those key pillars and translate them to different mediums, like as long as you know what those pillars are, you can generally like move them over. So there's this piece I produced with Zillion. He's like the time wizard, and he had a mechanic in our card game that could turn back time and whatnot, obviously. So like in the film that we made the time travel aspect basically like a key plot driver. So there's just, I think a big part of it with like translating between mediums is always just like identifying like the core elements and then translating them in a way that's like housed in the new medium well, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And you've worked on actually creating some content from scratch. How did that journey work to bring linear to life?
Sure. I mean, a lot of it is like the same thing, right? I think like IP, when you break it down, it's like a collection of stories, characters, and iconography wrapped around like a big idea or a big question with like multiple entry points for the audience and ways for them to identify. So I think I just always start out with what's the big question like the story is asking. Like my favorite movie of all time is probably Rocky, right? And I think Rocky asked a pretty big question that I didn't understand until after I was 35, which was how do you define victory if you're not going to win? It's like a big thorny question that you can build like an entire franchise off that. And then something like Game of Thrones is asked a big question too, which is like, can you be a good person and rule if you have to be basically amoral to rule in this world? And if you look at the story through that lens, like every character embodies a different side of that. So I think when starting new IPs, I start with a big question and then I try to build as many like points for audiences to identify as possible. And that's like, nobody does it better than like Harry Potter, right? So it's like the four houses, like everybody in my life, like all the millennials can just identify themselves as one of the houses. And I think when you start with that, then there's different ways for the audiences to like basically like latch onto and enter your IP.
Yeah, fascinating. We all definitely pick our houses at an early age. I don't think that changes. Let's see, how are you thinking through, taking learnings from games into film and TV and potentially back?
Yeah, I mean, I would just add that, in the IP takeover that I mentioned, we're just outright stealing that idea of houses, So it's sort of a factional universe with a bunch of, instead of houses, they're auto street racing gangs, but with the express purpose of, distinct personalities that, assign these sort of micro communities. Yeah, I mean, how did you phrase that?
What are some of the learnings from film and TV that you think games can take away for IP building and transmedia opportunities, setting the IP up for transmedia, and potentially also the other way around?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I totally agree with Ben as it relates to like the really secret ingredient that we believe is when audiences become more and they really start to kind of engage and help build out the world that ultimately becomes canon. That's challenging sometimes when you're working with sort of traditional creators. Like we have a project with George R. R. Martin, And he's not really into that idea of like opening the floodgates of, you know, I mean, like he's cool with fan fiction, but like that sits over there. The idea that it would actually be integrated and sort of elevate to canon is just something he can't get his mind around. Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, I don't know. I don't know that I have a good answer to that. I mean, at the end of the day, like we feel like we're trying very hard to learn as much from the gaming world as we can, and I'm not sure we have anything to offer in return so far. With Takeover, for example, we're building out, so we're making a feature film that sort of kicks off and establishes the world, but we're also building a pretty significant Roblox experience, actually in collaboration with Maximilian, who made Frontlines, right? So we're just kind of standing back, and we've got a lot of ideas, but mostly we're sort of leaning on those guys to tell us, like, hey, here are the pieces that we think are interesting. I have been really fascinated with the idea of like in-world filmmaking, because that happens to be actually a part of the actual, you know, real world of Takeover, where everybody has their phones out and they're kind of capturing these events as they happen. So it's been interesting to kind of bring that, like, hey, what if your character's holding a camera, and, you know, thinking through, you know, what plane the UGC happens at has been an interesting learning experience for us.
That's awesome. Ben, how are you thinking, you know, on that thought of experiencing stories through the lens of the creator? You know, all of the VTubers, you have the episodic content that drops. How are you thinking through impacting storytelling through that? What kind of new avenues does that open for you?
You know, it's making them not have to think in a new way. Learning to write a book, you have to start thinking in a third-person angle. You know, I'm not up here saying Ben thinks this, Ben thinks that. I'm not one of thankfully, although it might make the conversation a little bit more fun. So the transmedia style that we've developed it's all from the selfie angle. So it's people just tweet the same way that they would normally, except they get to play in a world with, you know, with cyberpunk worlds, with dystopian, urban fantasy style worlds. And I think, you know, the real key of transmedia is creating many different levels of investment for the fans. That it can be, you have different levels of fans. You want spectator sports, like with, you know, Riot innovated and the team behind BITKRAFT with esports. And you could be a spectator when you got older and you didn't have time to sink 10 hours on the weekend into the game. You could live vicariously through them. With ours, we have super simple. You can just log in for the memes, follow those, or you can go deeper into the world, into fully immersive games in the future. So transmedia should be that different appetizers, main courses, everything else.
Very cool. Derick, what do you think are some of the biggest missteps people make when trying to set up the IP for transmedia?
I didn't know I was going to get this question. Biggest missteps. Well, I wouldn't say missteps. I would say like maybe focus. Let's maybe keep it there. I think it's like the biggest one I see all the time is the focus on world building versus character. You know, when you're going from games to like quote unquote linear media, like they're just two different experiences. And I think like world building and lore is super important in games, and it's really important in linear media. But in linear media, it's really about the characters. And I know this isn't a game, but I use the Black Panther IP as a good example, which is like, I think vibranium is really cool. It's like magical space metal. I think that's great. But I think what makes it interesting is what it makes like Eric Killmonger and T'Challa do, right? It's like the moral choices like that metal makes those guys make is what makes like that IP fascinating to me, you know? And even something like, my favorite show is probably Mad Men. And if you think about the amount of world building that's revealed through the characters in Mad Men, right? The different strata of society, how like certain people are kept out, like men, women, like even like, you know, Don is from like a farm, you know what I mean? So he's kind of kept out. And then like women, African Americans and whatnot, it's all like pretty dense world building from like 1960s America, but it comes through all in character and conversation. And I think I would probably end it with this, is that like, you know, my favorite game is Zelda, right? Breath of the Wild. If you look at the screen, like 90% of it is the world. So I understand why world building is so important in games. But you look at any TV show, it's basically like 90% talking heads. So it's really about the characters. And I think it's really like an adjustment in thinking, and that like the world and the lore is super important, but it's got to come through the characters, and that's how you're going to get people to invest. You know, otherwise, like we've all seen the movies where it's like it's AP history time. This is the history of the world, and I just like totally fall asleep. You know what I mean? So I think that's like probably the biggest like shift in thinking that has to happen when you do more of these adaptations. Yeah.
So if you're a game studio that's emerging and you've maybe raised a seed or a Series A, how and when you think you should start planning for that and setting the tracks for?
Sure, I think a lot of it is like building your IP with flexibility in mind, because like making good games or making any game is pretty much impossible. Making a great one is like so hard, and I really like appreciate that. So I think when building out the IP is like building with flexibility in mind. You optimize for the first thing you're going to come out with, which is probably a game, but there should be enough flexibility in there to like adjust as you incorporate more mediums, I think. Yeah.
That makes sense. That makes sense. Elsie, how do you think? When is the right point in time to think about starting to do some short form content? You obviously make it much cheaper and faster to produce. When and how can people think through? Let's say, oh, let's expand and let's try to get a deal with a streaming platform like Netflix or Max or something like that. Yeah,
it's an excellent question, because if an IP, let's say, originates as a game, then the sort of entrenched path, has traditionally been, all right, well, let's get the movie or let's get a Netflix series, and there's just a giant chasm between those two. And short form has always been sort of relegated to, I don't know what, gameplay or, talking heads, or whatever, sort of non-fiction. But what if you could do narrative, is sort of what we're building for, as one of the things we're building for. And it remains to be seen, because there really isn't a, to my knowledge, there isn't a, the things that Ben and 555 are doing are probably as close as you can get to like true narrative short form at scale. But, I'm really excited about it. We sort of call that lane intermediate, right? Where it might be an answer to that question about when should you start thinking about it, because if you had a low-cost way that was tens of thousands of dollars to produce narrative-based short form versus tens of millions, then you've got the latitude to make a lot of mistakes and calibrate as you go and find those ways of doing exactly what Derick said, of letting the characters build the world through action and story. So yeah, we're really excited about that. We're doing that with Takeover, and we're pretty much everything we're doing has an intermediate strategy. And when our intermediate tools are kind of race ready, we want to unleash them on the world to IP holders, game publishers, comic companies, podcast companies. We're really excited to see what happens, but have no idea what will happen.
Yeah, I think it's definitely where to start is like Elsie's talking about the $10,000 investment versus the $1 million investment. So it's really backwards that it's thought of as like the final marketing piece, and they might go to Ogilvy or something at the last step to start this transmedia. But it's, from the startup world, we know you start with the smallest investment first. We call our model the lean story model, not the lean startup model. And we start with that first, the marketing and that validation of the product at the very beginning, rather than waiting until the very end for it. And, just making it a loose story as well. People get into transmedia and they think, oh, it's got to be this intricate web and with every thread can be pulled out. But the truth is the transmedia experiences should probably be the shallower experiences and leave lots of gaps that you can see your fans engage with it. And they start ideating and thinking and basically writing the story for you. Even when they aren't doing it literally like ours, you'll see the comments and they'll come up with good ideas. And then you can seem like the genius that you're connecting those dots later on, and they feel really satisfied that they guessed right. So it's a good experience for everyone.
And like jumping off that, I think like transmedia experiences should actually like stand alone, because I think like interconnectivity has gotten like really like, fashionable with like the MCU. But I think, as you can see now with Marvel, like with so many things connecting, it can feel like a little bit like homework. And I think like, I wish the other Ben was here with, he did the Harry Potter games, but it was amazing that they made $1 billion Harry Potter game without Harry Potter. It was just the environment was that connecting branch. And you can like, it's crazy because like I love the books, like I love Harry Potter, but for me it's always a book. My nephew doesn't care about the books or the movies. He just plays the game. You know what I mean? And they're like really enjoyable independently, but together they can form kind of like a gestalt or like a or something holistic that like means more. But I think like they should be able to stand alone, and everything should act as an entry point that can like lead to other things. But if you just experience that, it needs to be able to like stand alone, I think. Yeah.
Awesome. Derick, how are you thinking through kind of the lowest hanging fruit? If you're, you want to promote something, maybe that's bringing a character onto social media, similar to what Ben is doing, or creating a small linear piece that can work on different platforms to promote some new expansion pack or monetization avenue for a game, or is it a piece of music that you're trying to work with a bigger creator? What can people do? Where do they start?
Sure, I think like authenticity is more important than scale. Scale's great. Like I've been very fortunate to work at big companies where you can like really blow it out and kind of go nuts. But I think above all, it's going to be authenticity, and it's going to be like that's what your community is really going to. It's going to really like respond to. So I would just stay like really true to your IP. So I think I tend to start from the inside out. So really identify what makes your IP the IP. Like what are the core pillars? What are the key elements? And then just branch out of that. It doesn't, like Elsie says, like jumping to a show is like literally the Grand Canyon, and I would advise against it unless you can just do it, So I think trying like, even before Riot jumped to Arcane, there was like all those cinematics, right? So there were like 90 seconds, 2 minutes, and you build up. Even before that, it was like the loading screen for the characters, like there was a little movement. Just even that is like different. You can just test and validate to see what's going to work or not. And before I got into Riot, I did a bunch of homework on the universe side. They had all these short stories, and they had all these like kind of like tiny stories, short stories like built out. And I'm a big fan of like building over time. But I think the key thing is like you need to identify what your brand is, because like something that's unset up here is that we live in the age of the attention economy, and it's like how do you make someone pay attention when no one pays attention to anything? Like if you after any game conference, I dare you go on IGN YouTube and just scroll through the trailers. If I squint, most of it like bleeds together, if I'm being honest. So I think a lot of it is like staying true to your IP, finding out what's distinct, and then building out from that instead of going for like the highest thing possible.
Yeah, I agree with that. I would also say that maybe just getting back to first principles to make sure that if it's a linear piece, it needs to have a beginning, middle, and end. Like it needs to sort of stand on its own, like you said, and be a story in and of itself. If it sort of looks and walks and talks like marketing, I think it just gets consumed in a different way than if it's like, oh wow, there's an actual story that I can invest in here. However simple, just make sure that it goes somewhere.
That makes sense. Ben, with the shorter form, how does beginning, middle, and end work when you're trying to create some IP and character affiliation from grassroots?
Brutally. YouTube, they say it's like 1.7 seconds that you have to get them in. We're on TikTok, so it's about a magnitude lower than that. And so, yeah, I always tell our team we've got to be like bank robbers in that first section. We've got to get in and we've got to get their attention super fast. But TV shows dealt with, before bingeable TV shows, they dealt with this too. You had to think about every episode standing on its own. Netflix and the streamers took a lot of that pressure off, that they're going to know the whole series. But on Transmedia, I think you have to think about it a lot more like the old way of every episode has to stand on its own. In our case, every tweet and TikTok has to be entertaining enough on its own to get them to go back in and go further.
Makes a lot of sense. We're up on time here. This has been super fascinating to hear all your different angles to this. Really appreciate your time here, and they'll all be around here in case you want to look to build Transmedia IP opportunities.
Player, give me some brew and I might just chill, but I'm the type that like to light another joint like Cypress Hill.